Welcome to our first lesson, which is on ratios, fractions, decimals, and percents. In this lesson, students will be able to define ratios, percents, decimals, and fractions, write ratios as percents, decimals, and fractions, and this is a bit of a review because at this point we would expect most students to be comfortable with ratios, percents, decimals, and fractions, but we figured given our present circumstances, we would just want to make sure that we review and everybody is in the same place. All right, so our first objective here is to write percents as decimals and fractions. So you can write a percent as an equivalent fraction or as an equivalent decimal. And the word equivalent means that they have equal value. They are the same value, but they might just look a little different. So for example, a ratio that looks like this, 3.10, we would say that means 3 to 10 is equal to the fraction 3 over 10, which is equal to the decimal of 3/10 or 30/100ths. And that is all equal to the percentage of 30%. So all four of these representations of values are all equal to each other. So the ratio, for example, 3 to 10 is a percentage of 30%, or is a decimal of 0.30 or a fraction of 3 over 10. They are all the same exact value, just written in different representations. So how can you write equivalent percents, fractions, and decimals? You can use a ratio. A ratio is used to compare two values. It shows how one value compares to another. So an example of this, for every 3 red jelly beans in a bag, there are 4 blue jelly beans. And so we can represent this relationship of red jelly beans to blue jelly beans as ratios by using a colon. So if we wanted to say how many red to blue are there, we could say there are 3.4, but we would say that correctly as 3 to 4, which is just written out in words, 3 to 4. Or we can use a fraction, 3 over 4. So when we're writing ratios, order does matter. In all three of these examples, we compared the red to the blue. If we switch that and said, what do the blue to the red compare to, these would all be flipped. So just make sure you pay attention to order when you are writing your ratios. Fractions are just representations of part to whole. So if you have 1 whole, your fraction could be 1 or 1 over 1. So don't forget that 1 over 1 is equal to this one as well. 1 to 2 or 1/2, 1 to 4 or 1/4 or 3/4. And it took me, 30-something years to realize that your fraction written like this or written like this is just a division sign waiting to put those numbers in there. So fractions are really just division as well, which takes us to decimals. So just a quick review, as we move left in a value, that means our number gets 10 times bigger. As we move right in a number, it means our value gets 10 times, our decimal place gets 10 times smaller. So just some decimal, just some place value review. We've got the tens and the ones, and then as we move to the right, we have tenths, hundredths, and thousandths to the right of the decimal point. And then a percent is 1 part in every 100th. So 1 part out of every 100, represented with the percent sign following the number. I'm sure you've seen this before, that the percent over the 100 equals the part over whole, or percent over 100 equals is over of, just a numeric way to kind of help you change from ratios to percentages. But it is possible to have 0% if you have 0 over 100. 25 over 100 would be 25%, 50%, and then 100%. And don't forget, 100% equals the whole thing. So how do I change a decimal to a percent? Multiply your decimal times 100. This is the same as moving your decimal point 2 places to the right and putting a percent symbol at the end. So if you have 0.4 and multiply that by 100%, 0.4, move your decimal place to the right twice, you would have 40%. So here are some examples. 0.1 is 1%, or 1/100th is 1%, 5/100ths is 5%, 10/100ths or 1/10 is 10%, this is 35%, 50%, and 75%. All right, changing a ratio or fraction to a percent. If you have 7/10 and you multiply that by 100%, 7/10 times 100 would give you 7%. So when you multiply by 100%, this doesn't change the value because you're really just multiplying by 1 because 100% is equal to 1. So here are some visual representations. 7/10 broken into tenths is equal to 70 over 100 if you break the tenths into 100, which is the same as 70%. Okay, so how do you change a percent to a decimal? Divide by 100%. This is the same as moving your decimal point 2 places to the left and dropping that percent sign. So if you have 25%, divide that by 100, or your decimal place is located at the right of the 5 before you do that division. Move your decimal place twice to the left, and you have 25/100ths or 0.25. All right, everyone's favorite, changing a fraction to a decimal. You'll have to do some long division. All right, so an example, 4 over 5, you're going to do 4 divided by 5. So if you're going to have to do long division. So here you can see how it's set up. The 5 is doing the dividing, so it's on the outside of your division, and then the 4 is being divided, so it's on the inside of your division house, or whatever your teacher called it. So here's another example. 1/3 means 1 divided by 3. So 1 is being divided and 3 does the dividing. And in this case, you'll have a repeating decimal. So we'll talk about, as we move along, what do we do with those repeating decimals? How do we represent them? All right, writing percents as decimals and fractions. Here's some examples. Greg spends 45% of his budget on rent for his apartment. Write this as a percent. Write this percent as a fraction and as a decimal. So we have 45%. If we want to write that as a fraction first, we put it over 100. And then we have to simplify that. So can you think of a number that can be, that evenly divides into both 45 and 100? And if you're thinking 5 is a good start, you're right. You divide 45 and 100 both by 5. 45 divided by 5 is 9, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. So this simplifies to 9/20ths. Now, I can't think of a number other than 1 that divides 9 and 20 evenly. So this would be our fraction in simplest form. And then we're going to write this as a decimal. So if we go back to 45%, you just divide by 100, or move your decimal place to the right of 45 to the left twice to get 0.45. So 45% is 9 over 20 and is equivalent to 45/100ths. All right, so a couple practice problems if you want to pause and try these out before we move on, and then I'll do some explanations. So Jared donates 12% of his weekly earnings to a local pantry. Write this percent as a fraction and a decimal. So same thing here. We would take 12% and put it as 12 over 100, and then think of what divides evenly into both 12 and 100. You might start with 2, but there's actually a bigger number. You could divide both 12 and 100 by 4. So 12 divided by 4 is 3, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. So that simplifies to 3 over 25. And then writing this as a decimal, we take 12 and divide it by 100, or move our decimal place 2 places to the left to get 12 hundredths, or 0.12. Part C, write 80% as a fraction and as a decimal. 80 over 100. Oops, so there are solutions to the other one. So I'm thinking of what can I divide 80 and 100 by? And let's see, maybe looks like 20. So 20 would be the biggest number that we can divide both 80 and 100 by evenly. So 80 divided by 20 is 4, and 100 divided by 20 is 5. So 80% is equivalent to the fraction 4 over 5. And then take 80, divide that by 100, or move your decimal places 2 places to the left, and you get 8 tenths as your decimal. So how can you write equivalent percents, fractions, and decimals? You write your fractions as decimals and percents. So you can write some fractions as percents by writing an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. So this is useful when your fraction has a denominator that is a multiple or factor of 100. So if you can't do that method, you got to use long division. This is good for when your denominator is not a factor or multiple of 100. So you can't multiply to get to 100 in your denominator, or divide to get to 100 in your denominator. So for example, 84 out of 200 students chose tacos as their favorite food. So what would 84 over 200 be as a decimal and as a percent? So we can take 84 over 200, and if we divide the numerator and the denominator by 2, we actually get 42 over 100. So by making our denominator 100, because we can really easily do that division, we can really quickly write 42 over 100 as a percentage. So 42 over 100 would be 42 hundredths, and then 42 over 100 is also 42%. So keep a lookout for ways you can quickly change your denominator into 100 to get your percentage or decimal equivalent. Now in this example, 1/8 of Miss Hillman's clients live in New York, right? 1/8 as a decimal and as a percent. I can't think of a way to multiply to get 8 times something to be 100. So I'm going to use long division, and I'm going to do 1 divided by 8. And so when we do that division, this terminates, which means I get my last number at 125 thousandths. And so my decimal equivalent to 1/8 is 100.125, or 125 thousandths. And then multiply that times 100, or divide 125 over 1,000. And then I can quickly take this fraction and divide both the top and bottom by 10 to get 12 and 5 tenths over 100, which would be your percentage equivalence to 1/8. So 1/8 is equal to 125 thousandths in decimal form, and 12.5% in percentage form. All right, a couple more examples if you want to pause and try these out, and then I'll go through them. A summer camp dance program has 28 out of 50 students. So write 28 fiftieths as a decimal and as a percent. If you notice 50, we can multiply this times 2 to get to 100. So we would also multiply 28 times 2 to get 56 over 100, which would be 0.56, or 56 hundredths, which would be 56%. Now in this case, 3/8, we would have to do some long division in order to get to that decimal equivalence. So 3 divided by 8 is 0.375, or 375 thousandths, which is this fraction. If you divide each of these by 10, you get 37.5 over 100, which is 37.5%. So just a quick summary, and maybe this screen will be a helpful reminder if you want to copy this down somewhere or take a screenshot. How do you equivalently go between fractions, decimals, percentages, and ratios? So if you start with a fraction, multiply by 100, then simplify, then add your percent sign to get to a percent. If you have a percent going to a decimal, divide by 100 or move your decimal places 2 places to the left and fill in any gaps that you have with zeros once you move your decimal places. If you're going from decimal to percent, multiply by 100 or move your decimal place 2 places to the right and fill in any gaps with zeros and add your percent sign. And to go from percent to fraction, put that percentage over 100, remove your percent sign, and then simplify your fraction into simplest terms. So that was your quick review on fractions, decimals, percents, and ratios.